There's questions about eligibility. Gee, why only 4 years of play or 5 years of play? Why can't I play a 6th year or a 7th year, right?
Hey, this is Dave Almy of ADC Partners, and every so often it's fun to circle back with a previous guest who's been involved with something kind of interesting, right? Because a lot of interesting things happen in this industry, and probably nothing more interesting has happened than to actually all the way back to episode 1 guest, Dan Rascher, sports economist and the head of the USF Sports Management Program. Because Dan was the lead economist for this little tiny legal case you may have heard of called House versus NCAA. So with that case now settled law, wanted to circle back with Dan and get some of his thoughts and impressions about what that means going forward. Enjoy. Dan Rascher, do I have your permission to record?
Yes.
Okay. So when I first started doing this, you were guest number 1. So I did.
Really?
You were my very, very first guest. So I had no idea I had to ask questions like that.
Exactly.
So the fact that I'm not in legal trouble with you, given what we're going to be talking about here, is probably a lucky thing on my part. All right, Dan Rascher, thanks for spending time, man. This is obviously, you are coming off something that I think can only be described fairly monumental related to college sports. So let's get started by first explaining your role in the House versus NCAA case. How long have you been involved with the case, and what was your role?
Well, I've been involved. It was filed, I think, in 2020. And so me and my firm got involved pretty early. My main role was to sort of the same role I've had in the previous cases, O'Bannon and Alston, was to essentially show that the NCAA was an anti-competitive cartel. Basically, the schools were colluding with each other to prevent athletes from basically getting full access to the marketplace, being able to be paid sort of, whatever they're worth, right?
Yeah.
And so in particular, that case was against the Power Five at the time, times of, I suppose. And then the focus of the damage analysis, which is always a big part of it, is how much money is owed to these athletes in the past. And so that was focused on video game damages, broadcast NIL payments, and then sort of the individual NIL payments that athletes were allowed to start earning in 2021, but weren't allowed to earn before that. And so we're sort of looking for past damages prior to 2021, and then also they haven't been able to be paid for the use of their NIL on television. And so we're sort of adding up all those.
So that's where the Your Economist hat really comes on, is being able to go out and figure out, okay, what's the number, right? How do we begin to unravel this incredibly complex history of college sports and the revenue that's been generated that athletes have been, for all intents and purposes, bogarted from by the way that it was all structured? That's where you came in, and that was one of your responsibilities.
Yes.
Okay. Look at that. I got it. Woo. First try, mostly. Okay. So now the key part of this is, now this is now settled law. This started back in 2020. Fast forward to today. It went through a lot of back and forth in negotiations on what the ultimate settlement can be. So it's now settled law. Settled back in May. Is that right? Or a little early, April, May?
I mean, there was an agreement to settle end of last summer, and then there was a preliminary approved by the court last fall, and then it's like it goes through this process. Yeah, I think May. What are we in June now? Yeah, I think May you would say is sort of when. But the final hearing was April 7th in Oakland, and that's when the judge, sort of heard the final parts, and then I think she came out. I guess was it early? Was it only 3 weeks ago? I can't remember.
It's hard to track.
She approved it. Yeah, I think she approved it just a few weeks ago officially, and then now it's the law.
It's the law. So this is now settled law. So can you provide? And this is probably the hardest question you'll get all day. Can you provide like a high level overview for what that means for both athletes and schools? What does the fact that this is now settled mean for the college sports people?
So for the athletes, let's first look backwards. They're going to be getting paid $2.776 billion, but they're going to be paid out, I know, over the next 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
About $2 billion of that is from the House settlement, but this settlement also includes two other lawsuits that we were working on. The Hubbard case, Chuba Hubbard, the NFL player that some people may know, he was the named plaintiff in that case. And then the Carter case, which really was just getting off the ground. And so those two cases have the additional approximately $800 million of damage payments. So put all those together, lots of different classes of athletes, different payments going to each class, and then each athlete within each class. Some athletes fall in multiple classes, all this stuff. All those payments are going to go out over the next 10 years, so it's sort of equal payments over the next 10 years. And that's almost 2.8 billion. So that's sort of the looking back part.
Where does that money come from?
Ultimately, it comes from the universities, right?
Okay.
And the bulk of it is coming from the Power Four, but really all the universities are part of the NCAA.
Right.
They agree to its rules, and they essentially agree to collude with each other in violation of the law. And so
even if you're a Division III school, even if you've never done anything, it's like if you're like...
Well, I think it's only, and again, this is a great point.
Okay.
I think it's only the Division I schools that are actually paying.
Okay.
The NCAA is paying a lot of it out of their pocket, but ultimately, if they weren't paying it, it would flow down to the schools who would pay it. So it's sort of like when the NCAA says, "Fine, we'll cover the bulk of it." What are they really saying? That would flow down to the schools anyway.
Yeah, we'll cover it and go back to the member institutions to be able to pick that.
Yeah. So so the fact that it's out over 10 years. So, you take the, call it 2.8 billion over 10 years. That's 280 million a year. The NCAA Division I generates over 20 billion in a given year. So 280 million as a share of 20 billion is what is it? It's
hey man, you're the economist, not me. You got to be able to come up with those numbers more quickly.
It's like 1.5%. It's like 1.5%. So it's not, it feels like a big number, and it is.
But not within the context of everything we're talking about.
Not within the context of 10 years, yeah.
Okay. So where do you think this case is going to have its greatest impact? I mean, clearly one of the things that everybody looks to is like, look, it's going to... Now athletic departments can or must share up to $20 million with athletes on an annual basis. But what do you think are some of the other results that you're aware of where that might be receiving less attention than that?
Yeah, so the sort of going forward part is this is a 10-year settlement. So at the end of 10 years, we should remember, then all this goes away and then we see what happens. So that's sort of interesting. I know that's a ways down the road, but but the schools can spend up to $20.5 million a year right now, starting this year, on their athletes for the use of NIL, but there's no limit on how much they spend on a particular athlete. So they can spend lots if they want to.
You could give all of it to one person.
Yeah, I mean, they could.
Right. Speaking of future lawsuits, holy moly.
Yeah. And so the Power Four are bound by the settlement, and then schools outside of the Power Four are able to opt in. Now, when they opt in, they're allowed to spend these additional dollars, but then they also have to cap their rosters. So that's sort of one of the other.
So that's the give and take.
Yeah, that's the give and take. The rosters sizes will shrink, but the number of scholarships are going to go up to equal the roster sizes. So some athletes who maybe were receiving half a scholarship or a quarter of a scholarship, the school now could give them a full without sort of having any penalty.
So for some of those more non-revenue generating sports, then they may actually see those roster spots become more fully funded. Is that possible?
Yeah,
or is this going to focus mostly on football and basketball, do you think?
So I think that the 20 million is mostly going to focus on football and basketball for most schools, other than schools that have particular sports they're really good at that they want to make sure that they maintain.
Sure. Okay, right.
But the scholarships are sort of an inexpensive way to provide a lot of value to the athlete. Imagine an athlete who's now going to get a full scholarship. They're not having to pay all that tuition. From the school's perspective, it's not that expensive for most schools because what does it really cost to give someone a tuition scholarship? You just have to have room in your classroom for them to sit there and take the classes, and the faculty is going to grade
It's not revenue that you have to find and place somewhere else.
Yeah, you don't have to find it. And so to me, I think the schools are going to first spend as much as they can on scholarships, simply because those are cheaper dollars for the school to spend than actual dollars out of pocket. Now, the big schools are going to spend all of it very fast. I
Yeah,
mean,
right.
we
It's going to
already
be
know
competitive out of the gate.
it's going to be competitive out of the gate. And then I think the interesting part is what happens outside of the university with the collectives and the boosters, right? They're, in the last few years since July 1st of 2021, they have been the primary spender of money on college athletes. Now these dollars are shifting onto the school up for up to 20.5 million, but those collectives and boosters can still spend money on athletes, but those dollars are going to be subject to essentially fair market value, or what
Yeah,
the
the
NIL,
clearinghouse.
and the NIL Go clearinghouse, and sort of what the NCAA calls true NIL, which is NIL for the purposes of marketing a product. And so that's going to be, to me, the most interesting thing to watch coming out of the gate is what are those deals going to look like for those athletes, and which ones is Deloitte going to say are fine, and which ones is Deloitte going to say are exceed fair market value, and then what's going to happen at that point.
All right. So volume 3 of this conversation is going to be about NIL Go, Deloitte coming up with fair market value, because I cannot even imagine a level of complexity in trying to determine how that will roll out. So we'll come back when that's officially out in the market and take a look at it and watch the fires burning as people complain about how that was rolled out.
Right.
Do you think this is it for student athlete lawsuits against the NCAA? Are there other things on the horizon? Are there other things that are currently in process?
Yeah. So, I mean, Charlie Baker, the head of the NCAA, right, former governor from Massachusetts, wanted to come in, and he sort of got what he wanted. He wanted to come in and do a big grand bargain to try to settle things down and sort of get something in place. And he's done that and for the next 10 years. The problem is there's now lawsuits coming in on Title IX questions, right? If the schools are spending 20 million, do they have to spend it more equally with the women athletes and the male athletes? Yeah. There's questions about eligibility. Gee, why only 4 years of play or 5 years of play? Why can't I play a 6th year or a 7th year, right? So those issues are coming into play, sort of separate from this settlement, except the incentive to stay that extra year now. If you're a 7th year point guard on a Division I basketball team,
yeah,
you're probably pretty good at that point, right?
Yeah.
And you're like, I want to stay an 8th year. I'm a 5th year. I want to stay a 6th year because I can make an extra $500,000
right.
in NIL payments. That's better than what I'm going to earn with my degree, right? So I'm just
particularly in the case of women's sports, right? You have NCAA women basketball players who are able to reap immense rewards from their NIL deals and then move on to the professional levels with the WNBA and kind of get chump change for salaries. I mean, again, that's volume 4 of this conversation, and then we can talk about how the balances associated with that is. So, you're an economist by trade, and also you're very familiar with the law of unintended consequences. So, do you have a sense of what some of those might be? I think, I had a conversation with an NCAA volleyball coach the other day, and she was talking about she doesn't even recruit freshmen anymore. Her entire recruiting is through the transfer portal, right? And so I think it's one of these things. It's great to have student athletes being able to move freely and not be restricted from trade by going from university to university. The consequence of that, of course, now is that there's much fewer spots for freshmen. So what's the analog potentially for House versus NCAA? What do you think where some of the unintended consequences may lay there?
Yeah, no, that's a good observation. And we have seen that happening. And some of that is because the transfer rules have loosened, right? So and then the incentive to transfer to chase NIL payments is enhanced, right? So I think you're exactly right. I think freshmen are, athletes coming out of high school in the old days might be hitting these Power 4 schools, but now they may be going to smaller schools. And then once if they prove themselves, then they're going to sort of get called up to a Power 4 school. But then an athlete sitting on the bench at a Power 4 school has a much easier path to be able to sort of transfer down to maybe a less competitive school where they get more playing time, maybe pick up some NIL money that they weren't getting at the big school. So it's very difficult for coaches, and I understand that, and I think that this is something that maybe Congress would say something about, or because in the pro sports we have a collective bargaining agreement that says, gosh, you sign these contracts and then you have to stay. And so if you want to move, then sign a shorter contract. Now, there's a little bit of that happening in college sports. A couple schools, Ohio State, University of Arkansas, are trying to sort of sign these multi-year NIL deals that bind the
That bind
athlete
them
to the school. Yeah. And so you understand the incentive, and the athlete might be willing to do that in order to collect those payments. And so both parties can benefit from that. But I don't know if one of those at least is in play in a lawsuit with respect to Arkansas. So who knows how that's going to play out. But it is an unintended consequence that I don't think anyone's super happy about. I think people
right.
do like the freedom. Regular students can transfer from school to school. Why can't an athlete? I think people understand that that's great, except for sports, it's hard to build a team around athletes if they're constantly moving in and out. Right?
Particularly when you have coaches who are used to selling a program and consistency and building that the systems approach to success that they've had. Now, last question, and you brought it up, so this isn't on me. You touched on it earlier. What's the potential role of the federal government here, right? The current administration had talked apparently about Nick Saban and Cody Campbell coming in and serving on a commission or leading a commission to look at all of this. Do you think that's going to happen? And if so, would that invalidate the House versus NCAA? What possible direction could the government have here?
So there's been lots of bills floated over the last 10 years on sort of both sides of the aisle that haven't made it out of committee generally. But I do think now there's a higher likelihood than I would have said a year or two ago that the government, because now, but I think what it's going to do is going to take the House settlement as sort of given and then try to tweak around the outside of it. The NCAA wants an antitrust exemption. I mean, that's a big thing to ask for, right? We should be allowed to collude, et cetera. So I could see them getting a limited exemption. Again, I might not agree with it, but I could see them getting a limited exemption in exchange for some of these pieces, like maybe the transfer rules, or athletes can sign multi-year deals and maybe they could transfer once or twice or whatever the case is. And maybe there's a true NIL portion of that. I don't know. I feel like that's just, you're rewinding the clock in terms of under the table payments, right? I mean, we might be seeing that, if not this year, because the market's going to take a few years to sort of get up to full speed. But a couple of years from now, we might be seeing under the table NIL payments, happening because you've run out of the 20.5 million, right? And you're like, well, I still want to spend more. How am I going to do that? So I think those are the, I think Congress can try to address some of those issues, but I think it's very difficult. I mean, this is economics. I mean, the money's going to flow where it wants to flow. And if you put up barriers, it's just going to go around it.
Figure out a way around it. Started with collectives, and it sounds like it's just going to continue to do so, particularly in the wild, wild west that continues to be college athletics. Dan Rascher, appreciate the time. Good luck with everything going forward.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Dave.